All right, well, welcome everybody to the November 2018 meeting of the Mississippi PowerShell user group. Tonight we have Mike Shepard, and he's going to be presenting on GUIs and PowerShell. Take it away, Mike.
All right. So I've got some of my contact information. I've put a couple of links in the comments, which we'll get to later. One of them is a link to this PowerPoint deck, in case you want it for some reason. I always have a shameless self-promotion slide. I've been blogging since 2009, kind of slacked off lately. Written a couple of books, contributed a chapter to the PowerShell conference book, which Mike Robbins was one of the instigators of that. I really appreciated that. I think that's a really good thing for our community to, just to provide value for the community, but also to provide a place for people who aren't used to writing, aren't used to getting content in front of people, giving them a place to do that. I think that's a really good thing. Also, the PS Power Hour. If you haven't heard of that, that's something else to look at. That's another avenue to get people to be sharing content. I think that's a good thing. I didn't mention on here, I'm also the founder of the Southwest Missouri PowerShell user group. We've been meeting for about a year and a half. We haven't put stuff online yet. We haven't got to that point. But anyway, so why use GUIs in PowerShell? Right? This is something I get sometimes from people. GUIs and PowerShell are opposites. You use PowerShell because GUIs are slow, and that's not what you're supposed to be doing. And so to some extent, it seems like using a GUI with PowerShell seems like you're admitting defeat. But if you actually read the Monad Manifesto, which if you have not done that, you really, really need to read that. It's a visionary document that talks about his vision for PowerShell and the ecosystem around it. And he has a whole chapter on something that he calls the Monad Management Console, which really has to do with providing GUIs to wrap the PowerShell engine. So it's definitely not something that you should just give up on, not even consider. So some things that I like to think about doing for GUIs in PowerShell are things like gateways to scripting. If you ever spend time on forums, maybe in Reddit or PowerShell.org, you'll see lots of people saying, hey, I've got this script, and you'll see that it's a menu, where they're giving them options for doing different things, right? They're given some sort of what I call a gateway to scripting. I've written scripts, I'm giving them to somebody, but they don't really know how to run scripts. So I wrote an interface of some sort. Sometimes people will use a text interface for that, but people like GUIs, so that's not a bad thing. Also, if you're doing entering parameters, is it easier to pick a certificate out of a drop-down list or to type out a thumbprint? I don't think any of us wants to type out a thumbprint. And even think about tab completion on thumbprints. Is that even helpful? It really doesn't buy you anything. So in a sense, then you get okay. Someone likes doing thumbprints. Obviously, you need the thumbprint. Don't get me wrong, but getting to that thumbprint, just from looking at the big long string of hex is kind of not very helpful. Also, what about like an interactive console? You think about something like the ISE, right? That's a useful tool, or even Visual Studio Code. That's everybody. We're all moving to Visual Studio Code. That isn't a PowerShell application, but it's still a GUI, and it's something that we use from PowerShell. So just think about the kinds of benefits you get from a GUI. Think about getting those alongside of your scripts. And I want to be really careful here. I don't want you to embed your scripts inside a GUI, if that makes sense. I don't want business logic embedded in a GUI. I want you to write scripts and modules that aren't GUIs, and I want you to use a GUI to run those, right? Because if you can't run it without the GUI, then you are back to pre-PowerShell days where you have the only way to get something done is in a GUI, and that's not good. So also simple data entry, right? If I've got to ask the user for 10 things, I could ask them with 10 prompts, or I could give them a nice form. A nice form is going to be a lot more useful. I can copy and paste things in there, maybe a little easier. Use drop downs and list boxes and things, calendar controls, right? Things that people are very used to using. And you'll get better, more accurate data probably that way, if there's a user in front of it. Obviously, if there's not a user in front of it, don't use a GUI and just use a script. Maybe it's in a scheduled task, or maybe it's kicked off from some sort of automation on a build server or wherever it is. You know, the point I'm making is that I don't think GUIs should be the first step. I think GUIs should be kind of the last step. Right? I've got something nicely automated in PowerShell. Is there something I can do for an end user using a GUI that makes that script more approachable or adaptable or efficient for them to use? So does that make sense to everybody? By the way, I like talking to live groups because then I can see people's faces and people nodding.
Hey, Mike?
Yeah.
I have a silly question to ask you.
Okay.
When you say don't develop your scripts within a GUI, then my question is, why wouldn't you? Because it would just be another module or another you'd have your main portion of the PowerShell script, and then you use classes and methods to actually make the proper calls into your script.
Okay, so what I mean by that is, you know, say you wrote you have a PowerShell. I'm trying to think of a good example to get. Say you're writing a provisioning script, right? You could write a form that has, you know, fields, you know, text boxes for the different fields that you want, and drop downs, and pick a department, pick a start date, and all those kinds of things in a GUI. And then you have a button that says do the thing. I don't want the code to do the thing to be embedded in that event handler. I want that event handler to call a function that exists outside of the GUI in a module somewhere. Because if you embed it in that GUI, then when you say, oh, I have 1,000 of these to do and I've got a text file with all the information, I can't use it. Right? But if I just have a function that takes the inputs that I call from within that event handler, I can whip that up with a, you know, a get content or an import CSV, pipe it into that function, and it's all good. Does that make sense?
I was more thinking of you would put a separate text box in there and a separate button to actually put in a separate event, so that you can basically say if input exists within that text box, then run this method within that input box or within that text box. Or you can go the other way and do just a single input within the system within a separate drop down within that GUI that you're creating, correct? Or that's just a different style, maybe.
I think you could go that way. I think you'll find that there's still enough effort in writing a GUI that it's more of a single-purpose tool. If you try to have a GUI that allows, you know, say that form input or a text file input, and you know, have different places on the form for those things, that's going to be kind of hard to do. Not impossible, but it's going to be hard because the data might be in different formats. So for me, for the way I would do things and personal preference, I would take all of the business logic, and I'm doing air quotes that you can't say. I would take all that business logic, put it in a module, call that from event handlers, rather than have it in the actual script that has the GUI in it. That's really what I'm saying. I want to separate out the business logic from the GUI logic. And this is a pretty normal kind of thing to do, even in GUI development, in managed code, or whatever, higher level non-scripting language that you would do to separate those things out. Also, it's much harder to unit test a GUI than a straight script. So testability is kind of a big deal. And if you've got that code embedded in event handlers, it's really hard to test that it's right.
Yeah.
So
I've actually done it both ways. I started writing GUIs with PowerShell the way that Larry's talking about, and I actually ended up the way that you're talking about, because it's awful nice if you write a module and you don't even think about writing a GUI. And then later down the road, it's like, well, we need a GUI for this, for a help desk. And it's like, well, I can just use my existing PowerShell code that I know works great, that I've already written, and reduce my time to get it to market or to the users by just writing the GUI on top of my existing PowerShell functions. Yeah,
and that's the way I like it. And Josh is saying the same kind of thing in the comments, that he layers a GUI on top of the modules that he's written. And the way I kind of look at it is that I think of PowerShell as the first-class citizen for running my scripts, and users as second-class citizens, right? I always want to think about writing that automated, run it from a scheduled task kind of thing first.
Yeah.
And maybe there's going to be a user in front of it. Okay, then I'll think about a GUI.
And my thought too is, and you kind of mentioned this, is reusability. That I want all my code to be really reusable, and a lot of people who are going to come want to borrow or steal your code, which is fine. That's the reason I share my code, is they don't want the GUI. They want the code, so they can just get that portion or they can get it all.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Reusability is a huge, just the composability that PowerShell gives you. You can get a lot of mileage from that. And the more you embed, the more logic you embed in the form, the less that's reusable. So I'm going to continue on because we got a lot more to cover. And I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on some of these points. It's really just to kind of give you an overview of different places that you interact with GUIs. So if you use the ISE, there are GUIs kind of built into the ISE. You can think of the ISE as a GUI as well. But there's the command add-in. There's the script analyzer add-in, which is a GUI for interacting with PowerShell things. And so this is the command add-in. I don't know if any of you use it. I personally don't use it because I knew PowerShell pretty well before the ISE came about. But this is a really, really nice way of visualizing commandlet metadata. And for people who don't understand or aren't as comfortable with parameter sets and things like that, this is a really, really good way to expose that to them. Much, much more easy to understand than looking at the syntax in a help topic, for instance. So, like I said, I don't use this, but I think it's a really nice tool if you want to use it. Let's see, just using the ISE. So also with the ISE, it exposes some of its inner workings to the PowerShell session that's running in the ISE using this $PSISE variable, which lets you do things like, here's some code up at the top of this slide where you're actually modifying the menus in the ISE from code, which is kind of a nice thing to be able to do. Also, there's a command called psedit that opens a file in the ISE, which is kind of nice. So Another slide about using the ISE. The ISE is a graphical host, so that means it's a program that is running the PowerShell engine, and so by hosting the engine, it has to provide certain services to the engine, and some of those things are like when you ask for a credential. You've probably noticed that if you do that in the ISE, it looks different than if you do that in the console. That's because that's a service that the host provides. And the ISE provides a graphical credential prompt. It provides a graphical progress bar, same thing with confirm and what if prompts and stuff like that. So it's more just GUI stuff that happens around PowerShell. But when I talk to people about writing GUIs in PowerShell, what I always tell them is look at OutGridView and see if that's enough. Because a lot of times they don't really need much of a GUI. They just need something, and I'll switch over to the ISE if I can get that to work. So if you haven't seen OutGridView, right, I just ran get process piped to OutGridView. Now I've got this nice GUI that is sortable. It's not sortable very well, I don't think. Maybe it is. I think. Okay, yeah, that one's actually working. I've seen sometimes when things don't sort right. And I can filter and say, well, what about Chrome? Right? There's a million Chromes running because I'm running Chrome. And Chrome runs lots of processes. So this is a nice, and I can add some criteria to the thing to filter down if I want. So if all you're wanting to do is let the user scroll around through data and look at things, this is a pretty nice GUI. And if you want them to be able to make a selection, you can use the pass-through, and it looks almost exactly the same. The difference now is I can select multiple rows. I can use Shift Select and Control Select to do extended selection. And then when I click OK, it outputs the objects that I've selected. So it's a very nice, if all you're wanting to do is have somebody select something from a bunch of objects, you don't need to write a GUI for that. You should use OutGridView. So always, 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 if you can, use OutGridView. Anybody have a question about OutGridView? Hopefully you've all seen that. I will say, if you're running on PowerShell core, none of this will help you until possibly the first PowerShell core that's based on .NET Core 3, which is going to include WinForms and WPF. So at this point, there are no GUIs in PowerShell core. And OutGridView has been around since PowerShell 2 or 3, I can't remember, but it's been around forever. So it's one of the things that you can count on being there.
Yeah, it was introduced in 2, but they made some changes to it in 3, and I'm not aware of any changes to it since 3.
Yeah, sounds right. So also you can use some pre-made Windows dialogues, right? If all you need to do is prompt for files, right? There's an open file dialog, a save file dialog. I've got code in here. I think I've got a tab in ISE that has that in it as well, right? So here we want to create an open file dialog, and we're pointing to some directory initially, and we're telling it what filter to use. We want to look for CSV files. And so if we run all this, I get a file open dialog, just exactly, it's a system dialog. So it's pretty nice. And then once you've called that show dialog, you can check the dialog result. And there's lots of code. You'll find a lot of code out on the internet for how to do this. But you can check out the file name and see what file name was selected. So again, if that's all you're trying to do is get a file name from a user, don't write a GUI. There's really not much more. Now, you can wrap this code so it's nicer and more reusable, sure, but don't write your own GUI for that. That's a lot of work. And the users won't appreciate that work, right? They want to see a standard file dialog, and that's what you get it by using the system dialogs. There's also an input box, which looks a little different to use, but I don't like that one particularly. So this is basically writing GUIs without writing GUIs, that first part of the talk. Because one of the things I always say is the best code I ever write is the code I don't write. Right? Anytime I write code, I'm human. I'm going to make a mess. Even when I write good code, it's still a mess. And, you know, it's an opportunity for me to have a typo or a logic error or an off by one error or something like that. So if I can take advantage of somebody else's hard work, I want to do that. Same thing with using other people's modules and stuff like that. You know, Mike was saying that's why he shares his code so other people can use it, right? If somebody's written a module that does what I want to do, why would I write my own other than sometimes it's fun? All right, so enough of that. So you've come to the point where you say, I have to write a GUI. How do I do it? So the first way to do it, I call it brute force using Windows Forms. Windows Forms is easy to understand. It's been around forever. And the problem with it is you have to write a lot of code to do much with it. So I have just a little bit of code here. And all this is doing is creating a window and putting one label on it. It's not even displaying the window. Let me switch back over here. I've got, let's see. Yeah, here is an example of a brute force window. And again, this is actually cheating. It isn't. Where did it go? There it is. It's brute force, but I didn't write it using brute force because I can't stand writing things by brute force. So I'll click personalize, and you see it's actually got controls and some kind of event handling. So when I clicked on the button, it actually did something. So, but that's almost 60 lines of code to do not very much. So I'm not very happy with using brute force. One of my coworkers, a good friend of mine, wrote a big GUI this way because he didn't know any other way to do it. And so he's mad whenever I teach people about how to write GUIs because he still has it still in production because, you know, he wrote it and he wrote it well. But it was a lot of work to get all the numbers right, make sure you set all the right properties and all this kind of stuff. So I don't recommend that you do brute force Windows Forms, and that's why I have this very scientific comment here that says yuck and ad nauseum, because you will get really, really bored writing Win Forms using brute force. So there's another way to do Win Forms, and that is using something called PoshGUI.com. PoshGUI.com, I happen to have it open. I had some problems getting it to work earlier, but then it started working again. And this is, it looks pretty much like a standard GUI editor that you'd find in something like Visual Studio or something like that. And so you can, you know, write thing, and then you can go over to this button and say, oh, well, I need a click event. And then I can do this. This is usually where I get stuck. I can't find the code. There it is. There's the code. So there I have built a form using Posh GUI. And if I can get back where I want to get to, we'll put that in here. And you can see it's pretty much the same kind of code that we had before. In fact, the one I showed you a minute ago, I got from Posh GUI because I can't stand, like I said, I can't stand writing it myself. So, and you know, this again does kind of what you want. And you can see the place we told it we needed a click event on the button. and it's created a place for us to put the click command, but we didn't do anything there, so can't really expect to see anything in it. So it's a public website, free. You'll notice though that the list of controls you have is not the full list. So there are ways around that. Obviously, you could drag in a text box and then go into the source code and change it to whatever kind of thing you really want that isn't included. It does work really, really well. So, and you can now, when it first came out, you couldn't do this, but now you can actually save, different forms in there and go back and edit them and stuff like that. So, it's a nice tool if you want to build a GUI in a more traditional way. Another way that I see people using Sapience PowerShell Studio, which is a commercial product. It has a lot more than just GUI in it, but that's usually the big feature that I see people going for this product for. But it does have a really nice IDE involved. It has packaging stuff, so you want to, make an executable out of a PowerShell script. A little asterisk there because it's not actually making an executable out of it, but that's another story. It also lets you do what I call round-trip forms development. One of the problems with something like Posh GUI is what tends to happen is you build the GUI, you export the code, you start adding stuff to it, and you go, oh wait, I need another control. Well, it isn't always possible to take the code that you have now, pull it back into a tool like Posh GUI, and add that control. So it isn't impossible, and the exported code is segmented enough that it's pretty structured well enough that you could do it, but it is a somewhat manual process. With something like PowerShell Studio, they make that quite a bit more seamless. There also used to be a tool floating around called Primal Forms Community Edition. Was a free tool, but Sapient does not give that tool out anymore. You might see people talking about that, but there is also an add-in for Visual Studio, which also works in the Community Edition of Visual Studio from Adam Driscoll, Adam Driscoll. Posh Pro Tools, and it has a nice forms designer. It's complete. It's not limited like the Posh GUI. It has all of the things that are in your WinForms toolbox in Visual Studio will be there, and it's nice drag and drop script editing inside Visual Studio. At the time I wrote this slide deck, there was a beta version of a WPF designer. I don't know if that's still beta or if that is actually released or not. I haven't bought this tool, so I can't show it to you. And also, the WPF part didn't work on one or more of my machines. I'm not sure if the WinForms did or not. But it is a nice tool, and if you're in Visual Studio, just as part of your job anyway, it's something that you definitely would want to look at. It's a nice powerful tool, and it's a native tool in Visual Studio. So that's again something that would be helpful, because then also you have projects in Visual Studio. If you're already using Visual Studio, hooks for source control in TFS or what is it now, Azure DevOps. Josh is saying that Adam also has something called the Universe Dashboard, which I think is absolutely fantastic. It's a web GUI, and he's right. I don't think there is a designer for it, although he's talking about he's got a branch right now that has a terminal for debugging the universal dashboard. It's really out of the scope of what I'm talking about now, but if you haven't looked at PowerShell Universal Dashboard, poshud.com, you definitely want to go look at that. I've probably showed at least a half a dozen different business units at work that tool, and every one of them have said, I need this right now. And some of them within a day had already started building dashboards or things that you wouldn't think of as dashboards using it. So no worries, Josh. That's something that I want to talk about, even though it's not really a GUI. So look that up, PowerShell Universal Dashboard. All right, back to building GUIs in PowerShell. So we've got several different options for doing WinForms. I will say this about WinForms. Conceptually, WinForms is pretty easy. So that's a bonus. Not everybody who is a PowerShell scripter is someone who has a development mindset, a developer mindset. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but a lot of people in the PowerShell community are people who really don't want to be programmers. And so the fairly simple model of WinForms is actually, it's a good fit. WPF, which is the other main way to do GUIs in PowerShell, is conceptually more complex. Traditionally, it uses something called XAML, which is an extension of XML. It's an XML-based language for describing the interface. And as mentioned earlier, that you can use Visual Studio to build the XAML for a user interface. And I'm going to be talking about XAML most of the rest of the time here. Not XAML, but WPF. So I think I've got an example with XAML in it. I'm sure I do, actually, now that I say that. So here is an example where I've taken XAML that I built in Visual Studio, and I've just embedded it in a giant here string in a PowerShell script. That saves me from having to have files in place. And you'll see this technique talked about quite a bit about doing WPF in PowerShell, about generating XAML somewhere, just like you would with WinForms using Posh UI. Right? You're going to use some tool, whether it's Visual Studio or not, to build XAML, and then I have some fairly boilerplate PowerShell that builds the actual form from the XAML description. Then I've got some code to find controls and bind them to variables, and then I can add an event handler in code, just like I would in Forms. And now, since I've actually got variables, I can refer to those variables and properties in the event handler. And I mean, this works. And there we go. It did pop up. So this is the same kind of thing that I was doing in the earlier thing. And obviously this form is not a useful form, but it has, to me, kind of the things you want to look for in an example. It has multiple kinds of controls, and it has an event handler that refers to other controls and gets properties from them. Those are things that you want to be able to do pretty easily. So, like I said, this is pretty easy, and you see a lot of content about writing GUIs this way. The problem that I have is that nobody in the world wants to write this, right? You have to use a GUI editor to do that. And at this point, really, realistically, that means something like Visual Studio, which is a pretty big footprint. Then you also run into the same round-trip editing kind of thing that I talked about with with Posh UI, where I make a change to this, and then I have to go back to Visual Studio and export it again, and it turns out you do have to fiddle with the XML a little bit here to get it to load. It's not a lot of fun. So another way to look at that is this is not a pure PowerShell solution, right? And I'm not a pure PowerShell fanatic. I don't mind if you want to embed C# in your PowerShell. That's fine. I would prefer an all PowerShell solution. So let's talk about doing WPF in PowerShell without XAML. So this was one of the first steps that I had in kind of writing this stuff. And I'll tell you this, when I started writing WPF stuff in PowerShell, one of the things that kind of hamstrung me a little bit is that I really don't know WPF. So writing a WPF library without knowing WPF is maybe stupid, but it worked pretty well. So I'm learning WPF as I need more things in my library. But let me show you what WPF looks like brute force. So here, this is brute force WPF, and it looks a lot like brute force WinForms, right? I have some an assembly that I want to pull in. This is the WPF assembly, and now just like we did in the brute force WinForms, I'm going to create objects. I'm going to set properties. I'm going to create objects. I'm going to set properties. I'm going to add event handlers, right? And it looks kind of like the WinForm brute force thing. And you get a nice interface. You actually get a nicer interface with WPF. That's one of the nice things about WPF over WinForms. WinForms makes you explicitly lay out every element. You have to say this is the left and the right and the top and the bottom, or I guess it's just left and top and width and height. I'm not sure. It's been too long. But you have to tell it exactly where on the form every control is. With WPF, it's more laid out like HTML. So you say, here's a thing, and here are things that are contained inside it. And the controls in WPF understand how to tell their parents how to lay them out. And so it's a little less fiddly, if that makes sense. So this is nice compared to, it's a little nicer than WinForms because I don't have to have as many properties set, right? I'm only really setting properties that I care about, names, content, the text, stuff like that. Where in the WinForms example, notice that I have to set all these different things, right? So that's a nice advantage of using brute force WPF. I've not seen anybody write about this ever. I only write about it kind of as a stopping point on the way to the actual answer for me. Where to go? And that is this project that I have. And the project came about, I teach PowerShell where I work from time to time, 4 or 5 times a year. And in describing things that are good about PowerShell, I mentioned that it's a nice language for writing DSLs. So if you haven't written if you don't know what DSLs are, it's a domain-specific language. The idea is that I have something that doesn't really look like code. It looks much more like a description of what I want. DSC, the configuration in a DSC thing is a DSL. There are several places in PowerShell that we use DSL, several very popular modules. Problem is that I have is that when I describe DSLs at that point in the course, I can't really explain any of those modules without going into a lot of side story. It kind of derails the topic at that point. So I was trying to find a DSL that would be immediately understandable. So this is for the most part a fairly understandable DSL without knowing scripting. The other thing is I actually talk about building GUIs in PowerShell when I teach it, and I tell people, because I work for a technology company, so there's a lot of developers there, and I tell them, if you're going to build a complex GUI, don't write it in PowerShell, right? Use a managed language. I don't want to say a real language, but use a managed language, because the tooling, right, all of the utilities and stuff, the development tool set is much better for things like C# or even VB.NET if you want to go that direction. So really, I tell them to only use PowerShell for data entry, or for GUIs, for something easy like a data entry form. And then I got thinking, writing data entry forms still kind of sucks in PowerShell, right? Because think about all the different ways that I've showed you to write these things. It's still a lot of code, or the process is kind of gross. So I got thinking, PowerShell is a great language for simplifying things. What can I do to simplify writing data entry? And that was really my goal. It wasn't to write a framework around WPF. It was really, how do I make it simple to write a data entry form? And I think I have succeeded on that first goal, at least, beyond my wildest dreams. So this is actually a working script. So, and actually, I think I've got it open over here. So this is actually an example in the WPF Bot, which is the name of the thing, WPF Bot 3000. It's actually an example in that repo. The idea here is I have a dialog, which is a window that is going to return something. That's how dialog is used. And in that dialog, I have a text box called first name, a text box called last name, a text box called email address, and then a date picker called reminder date. And if I run this, I have exactly what I asked for. And if I fill it in, whatever, it doesn't really matter. And we'll pick a date, because why not? When I tell it OK, it outputs an object that has properties that are named after the things in the data entry tool. So to me, that's about as easy as you could possibly get for a data entry tool. I can also do something more less data entry-ish. This is something very much like what I've done in the other examples, in the other ways. Here I've got a window, and in it I have a data entry grid, which that's kind of a technical detail. I have a text box called name, a button called personalize. Why is that named Mike? That's weird. But it doesn't really matter what it's named for that, I guess. And here's the action, right? The event handler for it. And there's a label. And when I run this, again, it does kind of what you would expect it to do. So this is a more advanced example that has, like I said, it's got an event handler, and I've got a reference to a control in it. And what you notice is I didn't have to do anything to know, or I didn't write any code to find this control. Right? I've named the control. The control is called name, so I can just use that as a variable name, and it works just fine. Show a couple more examples of things. Here's a window showing a grid. Oh, I guess I didn't close that. There it is. I didn't close this. There we go. A window showing a grid. And so you see how easy that was. And all I had to do, I just had to tell it how many columns. And it's going to keep adding rows as it cycles around. Not a lot to see there. Something a little more interesting. This is more of an in-depth example. Most of this is just straightforward PowerShell. The actual fun comes down here when we have a window with a stack panel, then image. Here we've got some properties for it, and the first image in the pictures directory is going to be loaded to start with, and then I have a couple of buttons that call this function that basically just cycle you through. But this is the actual, again, notice I don't have any real code inside the GUI. The code is outside of the GUI. I didn't put it in a module, but you kind of get the idea. And there you can see I'm scrolling through the images in my, and in the it's outputting it as well to the screen because I've got a write host here. So I'll show you one more thing, and this is kind of funny. As I was writing this module, Jeff Hicks had a post about expanding shortened URLs, and he wrote WPF stuff to do it, and it was fine how he wrote it. But when he wrote it, I thought this would be a good example of how much easier it is to write. And actually, this is even an old example because it's a lot shorter now. But again, I've got a data entry grid. And so the idea of a data entry grid is a 2-column grid with the names of the controls as labels in the first column and the control in the second column. It's just so what I'm looking for, a generalization, something that helps organize things. So in it, I've got a text box with a named short URL and one called the resolved URL. Here I've got it's collapsed. You don't actually see that one, and a button that actually does the code that grabs the actual URL for the shortened URL. And after it does that, it sets the text of this hidden text box so that you'll actually get that as output. If we run that, let me pull up a URL over here somewhere. I think if I go to bit.ly, I can find one pretty quick. Okay, so now I have a short URL, and we call that, click the button, and there it is. And it goes, oh, I did PowerShell.com. I meant to do PowerShellStation.com, my blog, but that's funny because it's not the URL I gave it, but there's a forward on PowerShell.com that goes here. So, and I actually even have code in here that says, here's another way to do this without using a hidden control. So, I mean, if you look at this, there's 18 lines of code, and there's not even 18 because I got 2 lines of comments and a blank, and then 3 more. So it's about 10 lines of actual code. I think in his article, I think it was about 85 lines. So this is very, very easy to write stuff in. And this is the Posh GUI thing. So let me go back to the slide deck and talk through a few things about this project. So this was one of the things that I wanted to do, is be able to do easy data entry forms. Okay, knock that one out of the park. The second thing is, and this is a little harder, I want to be able to edit an object, right? I want to be able to say, hey, here's an object. Give me a GUI for that object, right? So that I can edit the properties. This is actually, there is something included in WPF Bot 3000 that lets you do something like it. The problem that you have, though, is that if you've got a fairly flat object that just has string and int and date, time, or easy properties, then yeah, this will work fine. But if I have an object that has maybe an object for a property or some other kind of value that isn't quite as obvious what kind of control to infer from the property type, it makes it a little bit tricky. So it works as a kind of a proof of concept. I haven't put a lot of work into it. This says since January-ish, which is probably accurate. The third thing that I started to write, and I've actually written one of these before, and the idea is something like the ISE crossed with SQL Management Studio. So if you can picture the ISE on the right, and on the left I have a tree, and in that tree is anything I want, in any kind of objects I want to stick in a tree, and obviously I can do that from PowerShell. And with that tree, I can right-click on it and perform operations on the objects that are in the tree, and the operations would be based on the type of object that you click on. So if you click on a service object, service controller object, right? I might have a start service and a stop service menu item, context menu item. And again, you would define the menu items based on the types. And like I said, I've written one of these before. I actually wrote it in VB.net. I wrote it back when PowerShell 1 was the newest version. I've updated it some since then. But it's kind of gross. It's a lot of work to do. And I honestly this was gonna be a big project I was gonna work on, and then Mike contacted me about the conference book, and I started thinking I was gonna write about this, and I thought, well, the problem is that it's really more of a C# thing than a PowerShell thing, so I can't write a C# thing in a PowerShell book. That wouldn't make sense. So I thought, well, how much of this can I do just in PowerShell? And one of the really interesting things was trying to generate that context-sensitive, the type-sensitive context menus from PowerShell. I actually have that working. I've got another GitHub repo called context-sensitive menus, I think, that works kind of alongside of WPF Bot 3000 that lets me do that. And I'm not going to show you any of that today. But this is a neat kind of tool. The group that I was in when I wrote this back in 2008, 2007, somewhere in there, they still use the tool. They use it every day, all day for most of their It's an operations group. So it's what really got me started thinking about PowerShell and GUIs a million years ago. So let me talk a little bit about design goals for WPF Bot 3000. The first is drop dead simple data entry forms, and I hope that example convinced you that you never have to write a data entry form again. That's just so simple. The second thing is you don't need XAML. It's powerful. It's a good way to represent it, but it requires an extra tool. It requires that kind of step to adapt the XAML into the PowerShell, and I don't like that. I say easy to follow code in the module. I think so. I've refactored it quite a bit, and it's pretty simple. Usable with other controls. This is something that's fun. Obviously, I've written probably 40 or so WPF controls included in WPF Bot. But what if there's some other control? Maybe it's just one of the handful that I haven't written that are actually delivered with WPF. Or maybe your company has bought a control from some other third party, or maybe, my company actually has written WPF controls for some desktop applications. I actually have a way to take one of those and inject it into the DSL with a line of code, and it's pretty simple. And then the last point on here is that these functions like text box or list box or button, right? I want those to actually output native WPF objects. I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I really want to just use WPF. I just want to use it, kind of in my own way. And that's true. All of the controls that I have in WPF Bot are either native WPF controls where those controls exist, or it's a composite of WPF controls where I'm building something out. Like there's no credential picker built into WPF, so I built one, and it's built out of native WPF objects. So, and this is the last slide, and then take questions. And it looks like maybe about right on time. So there's interesting places in the code to look. If you want to look at this, and you might disagree that maybe these aren't interesting, but these are the things that I think are interesting. One is the way that you do event handling, and there's two ways to do that. Let me get back over here. You can see here with the action, that's one way. Buttons have actions. I figured that was easy enough that you could just use that. There is also, I don't have that open. Let me grab an example. That's not where it is. Do I not have it on this box? That would be so weird. Examples, handles event, that one. Nope. Here's one of the ways, though. You can give the window a hash table. And in the hash table, actually, I think it's an array of hash tables. You can tell it which control, which event, and then the script block for it. There's also a handles event function that you can pipe a control into, which is pretty natural to do. I don't know why I don't have an example of that. There probably is one in the help for handle event. What? How is it not in there? All right. Well, something has to go weird in every presentation, so that would be, we'll call that what's weird in this. So there's a couple, 2 or 3 different ways to do event handling in this. There's something called attached properties. Let me find an example real quick of an attached property. Nope, that isn't it. It's almost it. Oh, I know where one is. Well, the other grid example. So here is an example of using a grid where instead of just having them fill in order, I'm specifying specific rows and columns. And when you look at these properties, you notice they've got a dot in the middle. That's because this property isn't actually a property of label. It's actually a property of something else. So this is something in WPF called attached properties. So implementing properties that have dots and actually belong somewhere else is kind of interesting. And that's something that I would recommend looking at the code. And this tells you where to find those things. Overridable output. So the idea here is that the default output is built up of, it outputs a PS object that has the properties of the PS object are the names of the controls, and the values are the values of the controls. And because WPF is a nested kind of thing, I can build a big nested interface and output a big nested object. You can also use this set window output to say, you know what, I don't want any of that. I want to output this other thing instead, which actually lets you build a little more dynamic kind of window. The composability, I think, is interesting. And I'll open this up real quick just to give you an idea. So this would be in public. This would be Dialog. So this is the main. You almost always use Dialog as your point of entry into this library, and there's not a whole lot to it, because really what a dialog is a window with a stack panel in it. Oh, sorry, it's a window with a stack panel in it, and some controls, and a button, a couple of buttons. I've got an OK button and a cancel button. That's really about it. So because all of these things play nicely, stack panel and button, it just makes it very very straightforward to use things. That composability really makes things fun. And then the extensibility, and this is what I was talking about, using controls from somewhere else. That is a fun exercise, using closures and the function drive. So if you're not familiar with using those in scripts, there's your opportunity. So I hope I gave you a good overview of using GUIs, and I hope I gave you something to look at in WPF Bot 3000. That's really my two goals, was to educate you and promote WPF Bot. Obviously, it's free, so promoting it doesn't mean I get any money or anything. So, anybody have any questions? Great.
If you have any questions, feel free to unmute or type them in the chat.
Thank you, Scott. I think it looks great, too. Obviously, I'm pretty happy with it. And I've got lots and lots of examples of using different control types, using different kinds of nested kinds of things with stack panels and grids and things like that. Yeah, we talked about Show UI earlier. I didn't talk. It's not in my slide deck. I don't see anybody using it, and I don't know. I don't think that's probably anything wrong with Show UI. And it wasn't my goal to write something like Show UI, but I think I probably did. I think if I went back now and looked over Show UI, I think it would look a lot like what I wrote. Yeah, I like I said, I've got a friend who he actually teaches PowerShell with me, and when we talk about brute force, he kind of grumbles under his breath because he's got a big one. So. Yeah, I played with Show UI, and before that there was something called WPK, which James Brundage he was on the PowerShell team. He wrote that, and I played with them a little bit, but I'm sure, like I said, I'm sure it was on me. I'm sure I just didn't get it when I was using them, but they didn't ever click with me. So this clicks with me. Yeah, feel free. Try it out. If you have if it doesn't work like you think it should, or you see something that you want added to, feel free to put an issue or pull requests. Whatever. It's all good. I love getting feedback, even negative feedback. Even if you think, oh, this is terrible, that's fine. We all have different tastes. So, but also look at the code, because I think there's a lot of interesting PowerShell usage stuff in there. Like I said, like closures and using the function drive directly and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think it was Jeffrey Snover that I heard this from. He said positive feedback is not actionable, so that's why he likes negative feedback.
Yes. That's a really good point. The way I look at it is that I'm always learning, and even if you just tell me, it's terrible, I can't do anything with that. But if you say, I don't like this part of it, then that at least gives me something to look at. Okay, the most complicated project I've used it in. Okay, this is kind of sad. I haven't used it really in anything other than toys. A lot of my projects, I did the same. I wrote a project kind of like this, with the name is similar. It's Visio Bot 3000, that lets me draw Visio diagrams from PowerShell. And unfortunately, I wrote it after I had done a bunch of Visio diagrams, which I hate doing because I'm colorblind and I'm not visually oriented particularly. But so I wrote this big thing, and I could generate all kinds of cool diagrams from it, but I didn't need to ever. So I know people. I have some friends at work who are using this and building big GUIs from it, and not hating it. So they're probably much more enthusiastic than not hating, but I don't want to oversell since I'm not doing the work. Also, the whole code base for the entire module isn't long. I mean, you could read it in a couple hours easy, and most of the code base is very similar. Like all of the controls, all of the functions for controls are almost exactly the same. In fact, I have thought about taking out all of the controls and using the register WPF DSL, basically using the extensibility to inject all the WPF things into this so that there's not actually code. Yeah, Greg, if you want to talk to me about VisioBot sometime, let me know. Hit me up an email or wherever you can find me, and I'll be happy to. Actually, and if you look out in my GitHub, in my documents repository, I'm pretty sure I've got one on VisioBot as well. So, because I've given talks about VisioBot more than once. So.
Yeah, I think this was great information, and I'm definitely going to have to take a look at this.
Yeah, like I said, it's sad to me that I haven't used it for anything yet. I just joined a different group at work, and I joined a different group a year ago too. So I'm kind of caught up in some other things that keep me from doing as much as I'd like to. But it's been fun. When I was actively working on this, I was consumed by it. A lot of fun to write. And there's still stuff I haven't written. Like I don't have any support for styles yet because I haven't been able to work out what would be a useful DSL syntax. And I don't want to include something in WPF Bot that is essentially writing C#. And I'm trying to come up with a simple way to express what styles are in WPF, but I haven't gotten any insight into how to make that work. So that's kind of on the back burner. But yeah, take a look at it. If you find something that, especially if you find something broken, definitely let me know what those are. But if you find something that you'd like to work differently, or want to add something to it, or anything really, I'd love any kind of feedback.